Welcome to the mud-churned fields of Shiloh, April 1862, where the morning fog clung to shattered trees and the distant groans of the wounded carried across the battlefield like whispers from a ghost army. Rain had fallen overnight, washing blood and debris into rivulets that crisscrossed the once quiet Tennessee woodlands. And yet, amidst the familiar devastation of muskets and cannon fire, something utterly impossible had appeared, enormous three-toed footprints etched deep into the saturated earth, leading from one shattered Union line to another, ignoring the natural order, ignoring the known laws of man and beast. Soldiers reported them in hushed tones, jotting sketches into their diaries, with hands trembling not from exertion, but from disbelief. For those first observers, the mud itself seemed to pulse, as if alive with some secret knowledge. How could such footprints appear where none had walked? How could the earth remember what no man had done? Archival letters preserved in the Tennessee State Library recount officers pausing mid-inspection, squinting at the prints, wondering if they were hallucinations, born from sleepless nights and constant bombardment. Yet multiple witnesses swore the same thing: these marks were real, impossibly real, and growing larger as the day progressed. Eyewitnesses: Private Samuel Whitaker of Company D, Sergeant Elias Harrow of the 6th Illinois, and a dozen others, whose names barely survived the muster rolls, described the same uncanny pattern: 3 massive forward-leaning toes, clawed in the mud, stretching a full 2 feet across the ground. Some soldiers claimed they could see faint grooves between the toes, depressions that suggested movement, a gait unnatural, impossible for any bear-wolf or man. Field notes from the 6th Illinois Infantry mentioned that the tracks seemed to appear overnight with no discernible origin or exit point. One diarist, a young drummer boy named Thomas Calloway, wrote, "I swear on my soul, the earth has been touched by giants. No human could make such marks, and yet they lie there, mocking us." Across multiple accounts, the tone shifts from bemusement to terror. The officers joked among themselves at first, calling them the devil's footprints, only for the laughter to fade, as the magnitude became undeniable. Scientific observation mixed uneasily with folklore in these early reports. Surgeons and engineers recorded measurements with compasses and rulers, noting lengths of foot impressions averaging 3 feet, depths of 7 inches, and stride distances of nearly 10 feet, numbers that defied any known creature of the region. Lieutenant James Monroe, assigned to recon duty, sent an official report to Brigade Command noting, "These impressions are not natural. They possess symmetry and depth consistent with weight far beyond any known animal. We cannot account for their origin. Morale among the men is strained." Even the Union chaplain, Father Benedict Duval, documented in his personal journal that soldiers whispered prayers, not to God or the dead, but to whatever moves in the night, beyond our comprehension, hinting at the unease these tracks instilled. Folklore had already begun to weave itself around the physical reality. Locals and soldiers alike murmured of the 3-toed watcher, a phantom of the forest said to appear in times of extreme bloodshed, measuring the courage of men and the weight of sin with each step. Campfires burned late into the night as men recounted rumors, passing stories from regiment to regiment, that the prints appeared wherever the smoke of battle lingered, that they moved too quickly to follow and vanished as suddenly as they emerged. Some whispered that these tracks were a warning, an omen, or perhaps the hand of vengeance from the spirits of the fallen returning to mark the ground where human folly had reigned supreme. Despite the fear, curiosity prevailed. Soldiers ventured into the fields, stooping to measure, to sketch, to trace their fingers along the cold mud. Private Whitaker wrote, "Each print seemed to hold a weight of history, a memory of every life lost in this place. And yet it was alive, pulsing beneath my fingertips, a riddle of creation and destruction. Observers recorded the tracks in meticulous detail, noting variations in width, depth, and pattern, all consistent across several fields and hundreds of yards. Some noted claw marks that seemed to curve with intentionality, as if whatever had made them possessed intelligence, a mind attuned to the chaos of war. Officers debated sending men to track the origin, but each attempt returned with frustration, reporting footprints that either ended abruptly or diverged into impossibility. Trees and stumps seemingly unaffected, the mud as if never disturbed by passage. The phenomenon transcended simple fear. It became an obsession, a fixation threading through every interaction. Morning drills slowed. Officers paused to inspect the terrain. Men whispered along lines. "Did you see them last night?" Children in nearby villages, hearing tales brought by passing soldiers, claimed to glimpse shadows of enormous feet at the forest edge. The battlefield itself became a stage for both fact and legend, each reinforcing the other. Reports included sketches, rudimentary photographs, repeated testimony. Yet despite meticulous recording, no explanation emerged, only wonder, horror, and an insistent nagging sense that the earth had been marked by something beyond human reckoning. Within this first hour, the first hour after dawn, soldiers confronted an enigma that would define the remainder of the campaign. The shock of seeing footprints that could not belong to any creature known to science, combined with the weight of thousands of casualties, already created a tension that tightened around the men like a vice. Some felt a mixture of guilt and awe, believing the tracks were a silent judgment, others a warning, and still others a manifestation of their own collective anxiety, an unknowable truth embedded in the mud. What was undeniable, these prints, strange, three-toed, impossibly large, shifted perception. The battlefield was no longer just a scene of human struggle. It had become a canvas for the inexplicable, where the laws of nature and war intertwined, challenging reason itself. By mid-morning, even seasoned officers admitted that logic failed to account for the markings. Reports escalated from regiment level to division headquarters, each document meticulously recording size, stride, and depth. Each note punctuated by incredulity. Engineers measured angles and spacing. Scouts described the orientation and movement. Yet all concluded the same impossible fact: there was no known animal, no human, that could have left such impressions. That fact alone, communicated to the troops, spread tension like wildfire. Soldiers began mapping patterns, tracing lines across the battlefield, noticing that the footprints intersected areas of greatest carnage, almost as if responding to the concentration of death and chaos. And now, before we proceed further, take a moment. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Share your first impression, your fear, your awe. We want to know how this story strikes each of you in real time, as if you were standing on the muddy fields alongside the Union soldiers. The stage is set, a battlefield soaked with rain, mud, blood, and fear, where the familiar rules no longer applied, where the ordinary logic of survival, movement, and measurement met the extraordinary, the impossible, and the unexplained. Where Union soldiers, brave, battle-hardened, and disciplined, stood confronted by an enigma, blurring the line between reality and legend. A single question lingered, whispered along muddy trenches and among shattered trees: who or what had left these massive three-toed tracks across Shiloh? The story begins here, in the first hour of dawn, with the mud still soft, the air heavy, and the battlefield holding its secrets. And as you listen, consider this: how do we measure the truth? When the earth itself refuses to obey the rules we know. April 6, 1862. The sun rose dimly over the Tennessee woodlands, casting long, wet shadows across the fields, once filled with corn, and the quiet songs of birds, now silenced by the remnants of musket smoke and cannon fire. Shiloh, a small crossroads along the Tennessee River, had become more than a battlefield. It was a landscape transformed, reshaped by human hands and human suffering. Trees that had stood for decades now lay splintered, snapped like matchsticks under the force of artillery. Mud churned and slick from rain and blood clung to boots, wheels, and animal hooves alike. The air carried a pungent mixture of wet earth, gunpowder, and decay, a smell that soldiers would not forget for years, even decades. Union troops moved cautiously across the field, their blue coats heavy with water and grime rifles slung at the ready. Officers checked lines, murmuring in low tones, their eyes darting to the strange three-toed tracks that marred the earth. The soldiers knew the strategic importance of Shiloh, a junction where supply routes converged, a key to controlling southwestern Tennessee. Yet in this rain-slicked terrain, movement was difficult, and every footstep could reveal danger. For men already exhausted from forced marches and sleepless nights, the battlefield itself seemed alive, each footprint, each hollow, each whispered sound amplified by fear and anticipation. On the Confederate side, campfires smoldered among the broken trees, barely visible through the morning mist. Scouts whispered reports of Union positions, maps drawn in hurried ink, and most curiously mentions of the enormous footprints that had appeared overnight. These were no ordinary tracks. They were three-toed wide, impossibly long, and they seemed to connect points of greatest carnage, as if measuring the blood spilled on both sides. Lieutenant General Albert Sidney Johnston had positioned his forces with care, yet his maps offered no clue to these unusual impressions. To the men in the field, it was as if the ground itself had acquired memory, a consciousness beyond human understanding. The Tennessee landscape of Shiloh in April was deceptively beautiful. Rolling hills dotted with oaks and sycamore streams swollen by spring rains, and the distant shimmer of the Tennessee River seemed almost peaceful. If one ignored the shattered carts, abandoned rifles, and the stench of death that hung in the humid air. Birds circled lazily, unaware of the human drama unfolding below. Rabbits fled quietly through underbrush, leaving small tracks that contrasted sharply with the enormous, impossible impressions etched nearby. The contrast, normal animal traces alongside something wholly inexplicable, only heightened the unease of the men on both sides. Local civilians who had sought refuge in nearby woods and farmhouses reported strange phenomena during the nights of April 5th and 6th. Women whispered of shadows that moved faster than any human could, and children spoke of enormous footprints appearing and disappearing in mud outside their homes. Farmers who returned to inspect their fields found three-toed impressions that led nowhere, ending abruptly among stumps or tree roots. Some claimed the earth seemed to tremble slightly beneath these prints, as though responding to invisible weight. These observations, passed quietly among soldiers and settlers alike, became part of the folklore that intertwined with the cold, hard facts of war. Union engineers meticulously documented the terrain. Captain Thomas Farley, surveying the field at first light, noted in his log, "The tracks extend over 400 yards, each stride measuring roughly 10 feet. Depth of impression averages 7 inches. The toes are clawed, no natural animal matches. Surveyors measured angles between prints, charted their course, and compared them to known troop movements from the previous day. The data was precise, clinical, yet it failed to explain the origin. Every fact reinforced the impossibility, the juxtaposition of strategy and the uncanny created tension. Brigadier generals circulated orders cautioning regimental commanders to focus on troop movements and enemy positions. Yet, no one could ignore the prints. Some officers hypothesized practical explanations, the weight of artillery dragging supply wagons, or even enemy deception. But the track's size pattern and placement defied logic. Diaries preserved in the National Archives note men hesitating mid-march, pointing to the mud with disbelief, murmuring about giants, demons, or nature's own intervention. Sound defined the battlefield as much as sight. The drip of rain from leaves onto soaked earth, the faint clink of muskets being inspected. distant bugle calls from Union regiments, and the low moans of wounded men, combined with the eerie silence that hung over areas marked by the strange footprints. Soldiers reported that in these regions, no birds sang, no deer crossed. Only the odd whisper of the wind, threading through shattered branches, carrying the memory of chaos. For men already psychologically taxed by constant engagement, this silence, punctuated by impossible footprints, was suffocating. Folklore had already embedded itself alongside fact. The three-toed watcher became a whispered companion for soldiers navigating the battlefield. Stories circulated that the prince appeared after nights of heavy rain, as though the forest spirits themselves tested courage or measured the weight of human failure. Some claimed that the tracks avoided certain areas, leaving sacred spaces untouched, or that they curved in ways that seemed intelligent, too precise to be random. Even skeptics, forced to observe the evidence with their own eyes, found themselves pausing in wonder, considering the possibility that the earth was not merely a passive witness, but an active participant in the drama. By late morning, both sides had adapted to the tension. Union soldiers moved cautiously, marking the prints on hastily drawn maps. Scouts traced their paths, noting intersections with supply lines and command posts. Confederate officers reviewed reports, curious and unsettled, yet with no means to verify or exploit the tracks. The battlefield, soaked and chaotic, had become a hybrid of fact and legend, a living stage where strategy, human endurance, and the unexplained coexisted. And as the sun climbed higher, glinting off wet rifles and puddles of water and blood, the men could not ignore the sensation that they were being observed not by the enemy, not by animals, but by something else entirely. Something ancient, something patient. Something that had left its mark on Shiloh in the darkest, muddiest hours of dawn. Before we proceed, take a moment to reflect. Can you imagine standing here on this field, feeling the mud beneath your boots, seeing those three-toed tracks stretching impossibly before you? Leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and the exact moment you join the story, your impressions, your awe, your unease, because in this story, your witness is part of the record. The stage is now fully set. Shiloh, battlefield, April 1862. Rain-soaked, blood-soaked, mystery-soaked. A landscape of human struggle intersecting with the impossible. And as you follow this story, remember the earth itself holds secrets that neither orders nor maps can fully reveal. And history for once trembles beneath footprints that refuse explanation. The morning of April 6, 1862, revealed more than just a battlefield drenched in mud and blood. It revealed anomalies that defied every measure of logic and reason. Union engineers tasked with surveying the field for troop movement and artillery placement meticulously documented each of the massive three-toed footprints, recording lengths averaging 36 inches, widths of nearly 14 inches, and stride distances reaching 10 feet. Lieutenant Thomas Farley of the 6th Illinois Infantry noted in his field log, "Each impression is uniform. The depth ranges from 6 to 7 inches. The weight implied is beyond that of any known animal, possibly exceeding 200 pounds per step." Compasses, rulers, and measuring chains were employed with painstaking care. Every measurement repeated to confirm the startling facts. No margin of error could account for the impossibility before their eyes. Command reports archived in the Tennessee State Library described how multiple regiments, at least 4, spanning over 2 miles of terrain, confirmed the prints in areas considered secure or previously cleared. Official correspondence between brigade commanders indicated a mix of disbelief and procedural urgency. Reports of strange footprints must be verified. But the observed pattern is consistent across multiple locations. The phenomenon is documented in writing and sketches, awaiting further investigation. Even the most skeptical officers admitted that such consistency could not be fabricated under the circumstances. Fact and folklore began to entwine. Surveyors and record-keepers went further. Measurements of the toe spacing revealed slight asymmetry, consistent with bipedal gait mechanics. Yet the curvature of the claws suggested prehensile action articulation, foreign to any documented species in North America. Observers cataloged the orientation of the prints relative to landmarks, cannon placements, fallen trees, and riverbanks. Many footprints led directly to or away from areas of concentrated casualties, a fact that confounded and unnerved the troops alike. Could a pattern so precise emerge without intelligence guiding it? Engineers noted that the prints avoided certain natural obstacles, diverting around stumps and deep ditches, implying awareness of terrain, a spatial understanding beyond instinctual animals. Meanwhile, medical officers recorded correlations between troop movements, fatigue, and mental strain with the appearance of the tracks. Field hospitals reported soldiers experiencing heightened anxiety, restlessness, and in some cases, temporary paralysis upon encountering the prints. Private diaries preserved in the National Archives contained vivid descriptions. I stood over a print twice my size, feeling my knees weaken, a dread unlike any artillery fire had ever wrought. Chaplains noted in separate entries that men whispered prayers, invoking spirits, God, or ancestral judgment, in attempts to make sense of these anomalies blending fact and folklore, yet grounded in observed physiological response. Logistical assessments provided further evidence of the prints' reality. Supply wagons and pack animals were accounted for. None could have produced impressions of this magnitude. Even the heaviest artillery pieces positioned overnight could not account for the uniform depth and spacing. Engineers calculated the necessary force and concluded that any object producing such marks would weigh in excess of a ton per step. And yet, no wheel ruts or indentations consistent with such weight were found in parallel. The implication was unavoidable: something alive, yet incomprehensibly massive, had traversed the battlefield. Confederate observers who had infiltrated scouting lines corroborated Union reports. Lieutenant Samuel Beauregard, detached for reconnaissance, filed his own sketch and measurements. 3 toes, symmetrical but clawed, stride regular, depth consistent with earlier observations. No animals or men could account for these impressions. These reports were sent directly to General Albert Sidney Johnston, who recorded in his command diary the growing unease among his ranks. My men speak of strange steps, impossible in their dimensions, and yet they follow a pattern too consistent to ignore. Both sides, facing identical, inexplicable evidence, were forced to acknowledge the anomaly, a mix of strategic concern and deepening superstition. Scientific scrutiny was methodical. Observers measured the print's angle relative to the sun's position, confirming no distortion from erosion or melting. Soil samples were taken, mud and silt compressed by immense weight, showing compaction beyond known animal or human activity. Engineers noted subtle scratches within the impressions aligned with claw tips, suggesting deliberate placement or movement. Measurements of the print's trajectory revealed near-linear paths, often intersecting with water runoff and low-lying debris, yet avoiding larger obstacles, an intelligent pattern embedded in the very mud. Even archival photographs, early daguerreotypes and tintypes taken by Union officers, captured the eerie reality. Shadows cast within the grooves of the prints highlighted depth and shape, preserving a visual record corroborated by first-hand accounts. When compared with known species footprints, the disparity was stark. Nothing in North America, wild or domesticated, approached the scale depth or spacing documented. Engineers, physicians, and officers confirmed the data in writing, forming an unbroken chain of factual evidence, an undeniable record of the impossible. Despite rigorous observation, folklore continued to seep into the narrative. Soldiers noted that the prints often appeared near areas of the fiercest combat, or where night watches reported eerie sounds in the forest. Some regimental journals described the prints as moving, subtly shifting overnight, though no one could prove it, creating an unsettling interplay between documented fact and oral legend. Whispers amplified fear and fascination alike. Officers debated whether morale would benefit from hiding the phenomenon, or whether acknowledgement was necessary to maintain discipline. In multiple reports, soldiers attempted calculations the force required for each step, estimated weight, stride rhythm. The results were astonishing. No bipedal or quadrupedal creature, natural or known, could satisfy the data. Engineers hypothesized a new species, or previously undocumented anomaly, but there was no evidence of existence beyond the battlefield. Each dataset, each sketch, each log entry strengthened the conclusion this was not imagination, nor exaggeration, nor myth. It was real. Medical officers cross-referenced accounts of shock fainting and psychological stress with the locations of the prints. Soldiers reported disorientation and vertigo, particularly when observing multiple tracks together. The correlation was precise, forming an empirical link between the phenomenon and measurable human response. Chaplains noted men turning to prayer, invoking spirits' God or ancestral judgment, reflecting the unavoidable psychological impact of an otherwise inexplicable natural phenomenon. By late afternoon, the battlefield presented a fully documented mystery. Engineers and officers mapped dozens of tracks, triangulating origin points and trajectories. Field reports emphasized the consistency of size, spacing, depth, and pattern. Every measure inches, feet, angles, distances confirmed the impossible reality of the three-toed impressions. Across multiple regiments, across Union and Confederate lines, the data converged. Fact and folklore intersected in mud, blood, and rain. And as soldiers observed, sketched, measured, and whispered, they carried with them both fear and awe. These prints, meticulously documented, scientifically measured, and yet utterly unexplained, anchored the story in reality. The battlefield was no longer merely a site of human strategy. It had become a laboratory of the impossible, a place where fact compelled belief, and folklore found fertile ground among rigorously measured truth. Before we move further, reflect on this. Every inch of these prints was recorded, measured, and scrutinized. Yet the origin remained a mystery. Imagine standing here yourself, boots sinking into mud, hands tracing grooves larger than any human could make, and knowing that history has left a record that logic cannot fully explain. By late afternoon, the battlefield had become a living ledger of impossibility. Every footprint measured, every sketch cross-referenced, yet the origin remained elusive. Union engineers and officers armed with compasses, rulers, and reconnaissance reports began constructing a full map of the phenomenon over 2 miles of terrain meticulously charted. Each print was logged with astonishing precision, 36 inches long, 14 inches wide. Stride distances of 10 feet, consistent, symmetrical, and utterly beyond known biology. The men calculated weight, estimating the force necessary to create each impression, over 200 pounds per step. No horse wagon or artillery could produce such uniformity, and yet the tracks persisted. Outproduced, outflanked, outsmarted. Whispers among officers reflected the growing dread. Even the most seasoned engineers could not reconcile the data. Soil compaction analysis revealed pressures far beyond known capabilities of animals or humans. Yet the spacing and pattern suggested intelligence, deliberate pathfinding, an uncanny awareness of terrain. The curvature of claw marks, the avoidance of obstacles, the convergence on zones of heaviest casualties, all implied planning, strategy, purpose, something beyond comprehension. Confederate scouts corroborated these findings. Lieutenant Samuel Beauregard, detached for reconnaissance, filed sketches and measurements. 3 toes, symmetrical but clawed, stride regular, depths consistent with prior observations. No animals or men could account for these impressions. These reports reached General Albert Sidney Johnston, who recorded in his command diary, "Our positions, our strategies, rendered uncertain by a force unseen. Our lines outsmarted, our men unnerved. Both sides facing identical anomalies had to acknowledge the impossible, a phenomenon that rendered their best-laid plans unreliable and their judgment tentative. Statistical and technical analyses only intensified the crisis. Engineers calculated soil displacement. Each print moved over 10 cubic inches of saturated mud per toe. Force estimates exceeded a ton per step. Trajectory analysis revealed near-linear paths intersecting trenches, artillery placements, and supply lines. Yet the prints avoided certain obstacles, fallen stumps, deep ditches demonstrating what could only be interpreted as awareness. Every angle, depth, and orientation suggested a force that could assess terrain intelligently, outmaneuvering men and machines alike. The juxtaposition between expectation and observation created relentless tension. Union troops had anticipated predictable terrain, expected calculated enemy positions. Yet the battlefield defied logic. Commanders' maps and calculations were insufficient. Each step of this impossible entity challenged artillery placements, patrol patterns, and troop maneuvers. Outproduced, outflanked, even terrain itself became an adversary, forcing soldiers to reconsider movement strategy and risk in real time. Photographic evidence reinforced the impossibility. Early daguerreotypes captured the prints with stark clarity. Shadows accentuated depth and claw curvature, while the linearity and spacing matched field measurements. Cross-validation confirmed uniformity across multiple locations, independent verification from both Union and Confederate observers. No natural creature, no human regiment could produce such coordinated, massive, and precise impressions. The human response mirrored the anomaly. Morale reports indicated anxiety, heightened vigilance, and fear. Soldiers stationed near the tracks experienced tremors, pallor, and moments of temporary paralysis. Diaries noted whispered prayers to God, to ancestors, to forces unknown seeking protection or understanding. Even hardened veterans admitted hesitation before stepping into areas marked by the prints. The battlefield's psychological weight compounded the physical impossibility of the tracks, shaping perception, decision-making, and human endurance simultaneously. Engineers and medical officers observed physiological correlations, vertigo, rapid heartbeat, disorientation, linked directly to proximity to the prints. Private Samuel Whitaker wrote, "I felt the ground beneath me hesitate. My breath caught, as if the mud remembered each fallen man, each scream, each death." The prints became a silent narrative of history, their mere presence influencing human reaction, decision-making, and morale, a convergence of fact, measurement, and legend. By mid-afternoon, the battlefield presented a fully documented paradox. Maps, sketches, and reports converged into a single, undeniable conclusion. The tracks were consistent, measured, impossible, and pervasive. Engineers triangulated origin points, plotted trajectories, and compared field measurements, yet no origin could be discerned. Every measurement confirmed uniformity. Every record corroborated impossibility. Across multiple regiments, across Union and Confederate lines, the phenomenon was undeniable. Outsmarted, outproduced, and outflanked every assumption. Even the folklore of the three-toed watcher found resonance in observation. Soldiers noted that the prints appeared in areas of heaviest engagement, zones of high casualties, places where fear, courage, and human frailty converged. Some claimed subtle movement shifts overnight, impossible to verify, yet persistent in narrative. Stories of shadows, whispers, and inexplicable sounds intertwined with meticulous measurements, creating a tapestry of fact and legend, a record that both terrified and fascinated. And so the battlefield became a theater of the extraordinary. Every footstep documented every trajectory, measured every sketch analyzed, yet the presence defied understanding. Outproduced, outflanked, outsmarted, the soldiers recognized that their understanding of terrain strategy and survival had been challenged by an entity or force beyond comprehension. Their observations, recorded with scientific precision, were now entwined with fear, legend, and awe, a duality that would define their memory of Shiloh for decades. Before we move to witness the human confrontation with this enigma, imagine standing in the mud yourself, tracing a three-toed print larger than any human foot, feeling the compaction beneath your hands, sensing the weight, the stride, the impossible force, and realizing that every calculation, every map, every plan has been tested and outperformed by something unseen. Something that challenges logic at every turn. Something that is very real, and yet beyond understanding. By evening, as the sun dipped behind the shattered trees of Shiloh, a heavy silence settled over the battlefield, thick, palpable, almost alive. The Union and Confederate soldiers alike paused to take stock of what had unfolded. Through the long, rain-soaked day, reports of the three-toed tracks had circulated from regiment to regiment, corroborated, measured, verified. Yet the origin remained inexplicable. Officers gathered in temporary command posts, poring over sketches, measurements, and diaries, their faces etched with disbelief, their minds grappling with the impossible. There was a tension subtle at first, then swelling, a realization creeping slowly like shadows across the mud, that their understanding of the battlefield, of strategy, of human capability had been fundamentally challenged. General Lew Wallace, reviewing multiple reconnaissance reports, leaned over a table smeared with ink and mud-stained sketches, sighing heavily as he traced the measurements. They outproduced our best calculations. They outflanked our assumptions. And in some way, they have outsmarted our intelligence, he muttered, voice low, almost to himself. Every report, every sketch, every observation confirmed the same uncomfortable truth. The prints were real, tangible, and yet impossible. Officers wrestled with the implications, the audacity of the unknown intersecting with the chaos of human warfare. The certainty of the maps undone by the unpredictable, the inexplicable. Soldiers on the ground felt it too. Private Samuel Whitaker, kneeling over a single print, felt his chest tighten, the weight of impossibility pressing into his ribs. The mud beneath his hands seemed to pulse with memory of deaths, of battles of despair. Each step of the three-toed tracks echoing through time, through the earth, through human consciousness. Sergeant Elias Harrow nearby traced another footprint with trembling fingers, the clawed impression curving unnaturally, hinting at intelligence, deliberation, purpose. "We are witnessing something beyond comprehension," he whispered, almost afraid to breathe. Around them, the mist thickened, carrying echoes of distant artillery, the groans of the wounded, the whispers of men recounting legends. And the footprints remained silent, immutable, imposing. Strategically, the battlefield had been transformed. Maps, once reliable, were now rendered tentative. Calculated lines of march artillery placements and supply routes were subject to reevaluation. The footprints had intersected critical zones, supply depots, artillery positions, and command lines with precision, and yet no known force could account for them. Officers realized that every prediction, every plan, every assumption had been challenged, outproduced, outflanked, outsmarted by a phenomenon neither army could control. The earth itself had asserted influence, shaping outcomes, guiding perception, dictating caution. Confederate observations mirrored these conclusions. Lieutenant Samuel Beauregard, detached for reconnaissance, submitted sketches and measurements that aligned perfectly with Union reports, reinforcing the impossibility. Even General Albert Sidney Johnston, known for his meticulous planning and strategic rigor, admitted in his diary, "Our positions, our strategies, undermined by unseen forces, our lines vulnerable, our men unsettled." The symmetry of recognition between opposing forces, both independent, both rigorous, both equally trained, validated the reality of the anomaly. It was undeniable, beyond fabrication, and beyond comprehension. The psychological impact on soldiers was profound. Morale wavered. Anxiety pervaded the ranks. Observers documented trembling pallor, heightened vigilance, and in some cases, brief moments of incapacitation. Chaplains noted a rise in prayers not only to God, but to ancestor spirits or the unknown, seeking understanding, protection, reassurance. Diaries preserved in regimental archives described awe and fear, intertwined. The men confronting evidence of something they could neither see nor explain, yet could not ignore. The battlefield had become a laboratory for both empirical observation and the human imagination. Fact and folklore merging under the rain-soaked canopy of Shiloh. Technical assessments reinforced this tension. Engineers calculated soil displacement, stride force depth, and claw curvature. Every measurement indicated a mass far exceeding that of any animal or human. Trajectory mapping demonstrated intelligence in movement paths, curving subtly to avoid obstacles, intersecting zones of strategic importance, yet consistently appearing in areas of greatest casualty. Observers concluded that the phenomenon operated with awareness, deliberation, even purpose. Outproducing human calculation, outflanking tactical positioning, outsmarting conventional strategy. The battlefield itself had become a teacher, demanding respect, caution, and meticulous observation. Soldiers internalized these lessons. Private Whitaker wrote in his diary, "Each footprint is a measure of our limits, a reflection of courage, fear, and human fragility. And yet, it compels witness, demands attention, demands record." Sergeant Harrow noted similar reflections. The anomaly was not simply a curiosity, not merely a tactical concern. It was a presence that reshaped perception, strategy, and human endurance. In tracing the tracks and documenting each detail, the men became both observers and participants in a story larger than themselves. A narrative that stretched across mud, blood, and memory. By nightfall, the battlefield had crystallized into a tableau of impossible precision and human reaction. Measurements, sketches, and diaries confirmed the anomaly with absolute consistency, every print, every angle, every depth accounted for. Yet the source remained beyond explanation. The phenomenon had outproduced all human planning, outflanked every defensive line, outsmarted the collective intelligence of commanders and scouts alike. It had introduced a variable outside comprehension, a force that shaped decisions, morale, and history itself. As darkness fell, whispers of the three-toed watcher filled campfires. Stories of intelligence, awareness, judgment, and observation mingling with empirical evidence. Soldiers pondered the prints, the field, the mud, the impossible. Each man, officer, and private alike carried the weight of both fact and legend. The duality of reality, that which can be measured and that which defies measurement. The battlefield had been both stage and participant, teacher and enigma. Before we move to the final reflection, the closing echo, consider this. The prints had outsmarted human logic. They had outflanked careful strategy. They had outproduced the plans of both armies. Yet the soldiers who traced them, who measured them, who recorded them with precision, ensured that history could witness the impossible. The day ended not with clarity, but with recognition. Some forces in this world cannot be predicted, cannot be controlled, but they can be observed, documented, and honored in memory. Night had fully descended upon Shiloh. A thick, rolling mist weaving through shattered trees, soaked earth, and abandoned artillery. A quiet that seemed almost alive, pulsating with the memories of the day's events. Soldiers huddled in makeshift encampments, boots caked with mud coats, soaked faces grim, minds heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed. The three-toed tracks remained etched in their memories, in sketches in officers' logs, a haunting record that blurred the boundary between fact and legend. The origin of the footprints was still unknown. Yet the evidence was undeniable, tangible, and impossibly consistent across miles of battlefield. Private Samuel Whitaker knelt by the edge of a small puddle, tracing in his mind the path of a single print. Its depth, its clawed curvature, its stride impossible to reconcile with any known creature or human. He recalled the fear, the awe, the suffocating sense of presence that had pressed upon him throughout the day. He felt the weight of history beneath his fingers, not just the blood, the mud, and the rain, but the memory of thousands of lives. The echoes of desperation and courage, all interwoven with something entirely incomprehensible. What if they hadn't underestimated? He whispered. The question unfinished, trailing off into the mist, leaving an open space for thought, for speculation, for contemplation. Sergeant Elias Harrow sat nearby, the ink of his sketches smudged by rain and mud, reviewing measurements and diagrams one last time. His eyes traced the impossible stride lines, the curves, the depth, the orientation, the intersections with artillery placements and troop formations. He had recorded, calculated, and analyzed. Yet the phenomenon remained beyond human understanding. The battlefield had outproduced all prediction, outflanked every strategic assumption, and outsmarted the combined intelligence of officers and scouts alike. The Earth itself had intervened, or perhaps something beyond the known world had, and it left its mark indelibly in mud, blood, and memory. Around the encampment, whispers of the three-toed watcher persisted, folklore merging seamlessly with fact. Men spoke of judgment, observation, intelligence. The imprint of a presence that seemed aware of the human struggle, measuring courage and failure alike. Campfires flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the mud, the tree, and the soldiers' faces. Shadows that seemed to shift as though alive, echoing the footprint's silent command. Stories were shared, repeated, elaborated, each retelling entwined with the undeniable record measurements, sketches, and observations verified by multiple units across both Union and Confederate lines. The psychological weight of the day lingered. Soldiers reported shivers, pallor, fatigue that went beyond physical exertion. Chaplains recorded increased prayer and reflection, invoking protection from forces unseen, seeking understanding where none could be offered. Diaries noted awe, fear, and respect for the phenomenon. Acknowledgement that some forces in the world operate beyond human comprehension, and yet demand observation, respect, and meticulous recording. Each footprint had become a teacher, each measurement a reminder of limits, each log a testament to human diligence confronting the impossible. Even the landscape itself seemed altered by memory. Trees bore the marks of cannon fire and musket balls. Mud still held impressions not just of human feet and hooves, but of something larger, impossible, intelligent, aware. The battlefield had transformed from a zone of conflict into a theater of observation, where human skill met mystery, where strategy intersected with the unexplainable. Every soldier who had walked these paths, measured these prints, recorded these anomalies, became part of that story. The Earth had demanded witness, and they had answered. By midnight, the battlefield lay silent, but the impressions, both physical and psychological, remained. Soldiers thought of the day of the prints of what they had observed. Private Whitaker reflected on courage and fear, on human limitation and the need for meticulous witness, understanding that history was not only shaped by decisions and bullets, but also by forces that defy explanation. Sergeant Harrow considered strategy and calculation, and how they had been rendered provisional, contingent upon variables beyond reason. A reminder that certainty in war is always fragile. And as the mist thickened, curling across mud and blood, the soldiers could almost feel the presence, intangible, immense, intelligent, moving beyond their sight, beyond their comprehension, a quiet observer of human folly and valor alike. The battlefield had been both participant and witness, shaping perception, influencing decision-making, altering morale, leaving an echo that would resonate through diaries, sketches, logs, and oral accounts for decades to come. Next, the story extends beyond the mud and footprints, beyond measurements, sketches, and diaries, into the realm of memory, legend, and continued reflection. We will trace the echoes left in soldiers' recollections, in letters home, in the whispered tales shared across regiments, where fact and folklore continue to intertwine. The Shiloh battlefield, with its impossible footprints, will persist as a canvas of the extraordinary. A reminder that observation, courage, and witness are as crucial as strategy and discipline. As the night deepened, a final thought remained. The earth had marked its own history. The footprints remained impossible yet undeniable. A measure of the extraordinary, a pulse beneath mud, rain, and blood. And a question for all who come after. How do we interpret a reality that defies understanding, yet insists upon recognition? The mist swirled, the campfires dimmed, and the battlefield slept. Yet the story of the three-toed tracks and the men who bore witness would endure, quietly, patiently, waiting for those who are willing to see, measure, and remember.